recording later. So good evening as we join both with you here inside, those of you online and others who will be worshiping, listen to me, joining us in the study later on through the recording. We're going to turn to page 26 and join in the opening prayer. This is in your student book. Let everybody find where that is and let us pray. Almighty and gracious King of the universe, we live in a world in which many are tempted to see greatness in terms of how many things they possess and how many people they control. We thank you for bringing us to faith in Jesus as a king who revealed true greatness by serving, even to the point of giving away life. We thank you for saying yes to Jesus' mission by raising him from the dead and declaring him Lord of creation and history. Help us to hear with joy the words of forgiveness which he speaks from his throne, the cross. Empower us to follow him in joyous servant discipleship until we, who belong to your kingdom on earth, finally enter your eternal kingdom in heaven. To you be all praise, honor, and glory. Amen. I sometimes say the prayers that they use for opening prayers could almost be the topic of a lesson themselves. There's so much in there. But let's go ahead and pull up here the slides from last session. If you'd be in your textbook on page 84. If someone be so kind as to read 7a.
Although God took good care of the Israelites during their time in the wilderness, they responded continually with ingratitude, murmuring, and disobedience. When finally they gained possession of Canaan, the promised land, they could not boast that they deserved it.
All right. So the that old-fashioned word murmur, right? That there was just a lot of grumbling and complaining. We see that over and over and over in the text. And of course, the as we sort of talked about last time, there's some pretty rough, and continues to be from the lessons today, some pretty rough reading with things, and hopefully we'll bring a little more clarity to that. Any questions about this picture here? You got that pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire here in the center leading the people, right? So they come out of Egypt down to Mount Sinai where the covenant is made. Then God takes up residence in the tabernacle, and then they will set out following that pillar of cloud or fire. They'll go all the way up here to Kadesh Barnea, get ready to go in, and the spies come back with the bad report, as we'll see. So they end up coming back around, circling, and ultimately entering in this next picture. Let's take somebody 7b.
The book of Joshua describes how God led the Israelites into Canaan. Although chapters 1 through 11 suggest that God gave them a quick and complete victory over those living within its borders, later passages in Joshua, in chapters 13 through 24, suggest that the nation was troubled by lack of unity and continuing resistance from the Canaanites.
So again, it doesn't take all of the ugliness or whatever, the yuck away, but what sounds like complete total annihilation of everything appears to maybe not be the case, because you kept reading about how they were unable to drive the Canaanites here. These people continued to battle them there. But the sense with the book of Joshua is that Joshua is the general, that God, with the symbol of the Ark of the Covenant and the sword, is the one who is commander-in-chief and fighting most of the battles. And it sounds like they have these united campaigns that just kind of wipes everything out and sets up their ownership of the land. But again, the passages we read both in Joshua and in Judges seem to indicate that that may be more idealized sense of what is occurring. In fact, some have suggested, and again, different debates, some have suggested that the book of Judges perhaps describes how the conquest actually took place, the books of Joshua suggests how it should have happened, and they would have, if they really would have wiped everyone out, that would have been better for them. And the big reason we'll see when we get to the next picture 7D is that the foreign peoples had foreign gods, and that was the problem. So, but let's go to Judges 7C. Oh, no, that is the foreign gods. So here's this sense. Go ahead and read that, somebody.
Those who lived in the polytheists, their gods were often personifications of the forces of nature or fertility gods. People believed they could perform rituals to manipulate these gods into having sexual relations, with a view to ensuring good rainfall and plentiful food supply for themselves. The Bible states that prior to the Babylonian exile in 597 to 538 BC, many Israelites worshipped these fertility gods, referred to as the Baal.
So here then is the problem. These fertility religions, these fertility gods, and we'll run across them regularly as we read through these next chapters, particularly when you get to the books of Kings, is that the Israelites worshipped other gods. And of course, as you know from that first commandment at Sinai, you shall have no other gods. But even before they get out completely from the wilderness, they have fallen into this, and we will find this picture also being repeated. This becomes much of the backdrop against which the prophets will speak to them, which we get to in another few units. So, any questions on this one? All right, and let's go ahead and do the final one here, 7D.
Judges states that the Israelites involved themselves in the God used surrounding. During the centuries immediately following the conquest under Joshua, Israel was spiritually weak and politically fragmented. If the nation was to survive in Canaan, it would have to deal with these two problems and develop a strong, stable leadership.
All right, so let's go back to the book of Judges for just a moment. We'll start at the beginning in chapter 2, and then we will scoot ahead to the very last sentence. Looking particularly at Judges chapter 2, starting at verse 11. Somebody want to read? All right.
Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They provoked the Lord to anger, because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashereths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord handed them over to raiders who plundered them. He sold them to their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress.
All right, I'll stop you there. So what starts to emerge? The Israelites did evil. What was the evil? Worshiping the Baals, right? And very often that's how they're sort of under the Baals and the Astartes, or the Baals and the Ashtoreth. Those are the two that are named, but it refers to the different peoples had different gods that they named. But they worshiped the Lord, or didn't worship the Lord, they worshiped the Baals, right? Verse 12, they abandoned the Lord. They abandoned the God of their ancestors, the one who brought them out of Egypt, right? They followed these other gods. They bowed down to them. They provoked the Lord to anger. And so what was the result of that? Verse 13, or excuse me. So verse 14, God gave them over. So it's almost as if God says, okay, you want to worship these other gods, then I'm taking my hands off, and you'll get what comes to you, right? And what comes, as you can see in this picture here, are these groups of people who begin to attack, and they are in great distress. Keep going, Mary.
Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them.
I'll stop there. Hear that then? So they would raise up a judge to deliver them, and they continue to hear the language, prostituted themselves, or some others say, let's see, lusted, mine says, lusted after other gods. So all of that sexual type language is because of these fertility gods and goddesses. Keep going.
Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies, as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant that I laid down for their forefathers and has not listened to me, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. The Lord has allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua.
Okay. So the judge would be raised up. There would be some period of deliverance, some period of help, but as soon as the judge died, there it goes. Back over again. It's very interesting. Verse 17 and 18 talks about their ancestors who walked, who obeyed the commandments of the Lord. And you're thinking back to what we just read previously and thinking, now, who was that? Because all we heard were how they were grumbling and complaining. And it goes on a little bit, say, let's see, where was that other line here? That they would, even though their ancestors are sometimes, oh yeah, verse 19, whenever the judge died, they would relapse and behave worse than their ancestors. So there, you get that sense that sometimes you'll look back and the bad doesn't seem as bad if what you're in now is really bad. Go now to the end of the book of Judges. Yeah.
How many what's the word? How many years is this from the original migration out of Egypt? How many generations are we talking about here roughly?
The Judges is difficult to tell. If you look at your timeline, if you got the timeline with you, I can pull up a timeline screen in case not everybody has that with them. Give me just a moment. It's way here at the end. I'm going to have to zip through a bunch of pieces. Here, you can see the dark black numbers all by themselves, 1 through 14. Those are your judges. They show up over here in this listing, and with Samuel, who we will get to see a little bit tonight. So in the book of Judges, Joshua's considered a judge, but then you start with Othniel through Samson. And so they show here maybe a couple of centuries. And it's hard to tell when you're reading the Judges when it says, and the land had rest for 40 years, or he judged them for 20 years, because they're in different tribes in different places. Are they concurrent? Are they sequential? It's a little bit of a challenge. And so they simply number them here based upon, like you do in movie credits, they're listed in order of appearance. If that helps. So it's several generations. Okay. I gotta zip back here. Go to that last chapter of Judges. Judges chapter 21. And the very last sentence And my translation says, in those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And that little phrase had been repeated a few other times in Judges. And it gives you sort of this sense that the problem, as it said at the end of, on page 84, Israel was spiritually weak and politically fragmented. If the nation was to survive, it would have to deal with these two problems and develop a strong, stable leadership, which leads into the topic that we're going to have tonight. And we're going to see how they transition from a time of judges to a king, and how that becomes both a medicine and problem at the same time. Any other questions? Did that get at what you were
Yeah.
asking? Okay. So let us turn, if you want to have your book open to page 86 and 87, you can. But let's turn to Samuel. And Samuel, as you if you got a chance to read through it, begins with the story of the character that gets his name, Samuel, right? You hear about this man, he's a Ramathaim, he's a Zophite, right? And you tell him where he's from, the hill country of Ephraim. His name is Elkanah, gives you his dad, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, and then tells you he's from the tribe of Ephraim, okay? And he had 2 wives, one Hannah, one Peninnah, and the story is set like we have come before in some of these passages where there's one who has children and one who does have none, and the struggle and the wrestle, right? And he would go up every year to Shiloh, where 2 sons of Eli's the judge. He has his son Hophni and Phinehas, they're priests there. And what do we learn about his sons? Bad news, right? Scoundrels, some translations say. But this guy would go up to that worship site, offer sacrifices, and he would give his wife Hannah a double sacrifice to offer, even though she had no child. She was deeply loved. Interestingly enough, my verse talks about the other woman as being her rival. Perhaps you have the same word there, but this went on year by year by year. And instead of being a joy to go up to worship, it was no fun at all, right? I mean, you get this kind of, again, the soap operas and the other channels have nothing on what we come across in the Bible. And one day, what happens when they're up there? Verse 9, somebody want to read?
After they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose and presented herself before the Lord. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made this vow, O Lord of hosts, if only you will look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child. Then I will set him before you as a Nazarite until the day of his death. He shall drink neither wine nor intoxicants, and no razor shall touch his head.
So there you get, the Nazarites were those who took special vows, would eat nothing that had anything to do with grapes, and they wouldn't, shave themselves. And she wants this male child. They would go up. And by the way, it says in verse 9, the temple of the Lord. It's not temple in the way we think of temple. It gets called different things, but interestingly enough, isn't ever called tabernacle directly, although some translations will do that to try and avoid confusions. But she goes to pray, right? She brings her distress to God. Meanwhile, and this could be a little class in how not to do pastoral care or caring ministry. What happens next? Keep reading.
As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation all this time." Then Eli answered, "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition. Go in peace. The God of Israel grant the petition you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your sight." Then the woman went to her quarters, ate and drank with her husband, and her countenance was sad no longer.
All right. So, well, he made a little assumption that he should not have made. She kindly corrected him and just indicated that, she was so desperate in her prayers then, and he said, well, then may God grant your prayer. That gave her some comfort. And then you get this little phrase that says in verse 20, in due time, we might say in overdue time, but in due time, she conceives, she bears a son, she names him Samuel, which means God hears. And it kind of references that most likely in a footnote. And the next year they're going up, she doesn't go up. And then here's when she tells her husband that she made this vow and that when the child is weaned, she will take him and offer him there. And he joins the staff, so to speak, at this place of worship in Shiloh. Any questions there? Chapter 1, that's kind of the setup. Then Hannah's lovely prayer. Somebody want to read that?
Then Hannah prayed, my heart rejoices in the Lord. Oh, how the Lord has blessed me. Now I have an answer for my enemies as I delight in your deliverance. No one is holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Stop acting so proud and haughty. Don't speak with such arrogance. The Lord is a God who knows your deeds, and he will judge you for what you have done. Those who were mighty are mighty no more, and those who were weak are now strong. Those who were well-fed are now starving, and those who were starving are now full. The barren woman now has 7 children, but the woman with many children will have no more. The Lord brings both death and life. He brings some down to the grave, but raises others up. The Lord makes one poor and another rich. He brings one down and lifts another up. He lifts the poor from the dust, yes, from a pile of ashes. He treats them like princes, placing them in seats of honor. For all the earth is the Lord's, and he has set the world in order. He will protect his godly ones, but the wicked will perish in darkness. No one will succeed by strength alone. Those who fight against the Lord will be broken. He thunders against them from heaven. The Lord judges throughout the earth. He gives mighty strength to his kings. He increases the might of the anointed one.
All right. It's a beautiful prayer. If you are familiar at all with what's called the Magnificat of Mary, there are many parallels between those two songs. Interestingly enough, it ends by talking about God giving strength to his king. They haven't had a king yet. And to the anointed one, the king will be anointed when that happens. But as this kind of sets us up, then they go home. The boy stays behind. And here's where we learn that Eli's sons are no good, right? They use their office and their position for their own advantage. And furthermore, they took advantage in all sorts of ways of the people there. It's just not a good situation. Samuel, meanwhile, we're going to catch this experience with him. And, Eli warns his sons. He says, come on, you got to change this, but they aren't going to do it. And so Samuel will be called, and he's going to be the one that will take Eli's place. There's kind of a nasty prophecy or two made in the midst of this, but we're probably familiar with the call of Samuel. You got a chance to read that. He's sleeping by the Ark of the Covenant, which is kind of interesting. But you get to the point where Samuel is on the rise up, and Eli and his house are on the rise down. Look at chapter 3, verses 19 through 20. Somebody read that, please.
As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord, and the word of Samuel came to all Israel.
Okay, do all of you have Samuel called a prophet in verse 20? All the different translations? So we're going to see a little shift here from judge to prophet. And part of what happens, just so you know, going forward, is that when there's a judge, we didn't spend really a lot of time looking at this, but it would talk about the Spirit of the Lord coming upon that judge to raise him up, to energize the judge to go and do what needed to be done. You're going to hear now where the king will be counterbalanced by a prophet, and that God will speak sometimes through the king, but more often through the prophet. So Samuel is the last of the judges, and he's sometimes called the first of the prophets, although remember, Moses was referred to that way back already in Exodus. So that's just a very quick zip through chapters 1, 2, and 3. Any questions? We didn't read everything there, so we got a lot of material to try and cover. Any questions there? Well, we start bumping regularly into those darn Philistines, don't we? And in chapter 4, we hear that the Philistines gathered together for war, and the Israelites went out to fight them. They camped at Ebenezer, the Israelites camped at Aphek. They drew up in the battle, and it wasn't going well for Israel. So what did they do? The Israelites said, well, let's go get the Ark of the Covenant and bring that, perhaps that, if we bring that into our camp, God will fight for us more strongly. And along with the Ark comes Hophni and Phinehas. We're told in verse 5 of chapter 4 that when the Ark came into the camp, there was such a mighty shout that sort of the earth shook. And somebody read what the Philistines say about that, verse 6 and following.
The Philistines heard the shouting and said, listen to all that shouting in the Hebrew camp. What does that mean? When they found out that the Lord's covenant box had arrived in the Hebrew camp, they were afraid and said, a god has come into their camp. We're lost. Nothing like this has ever happened to us before. Who can save us from these powerful gods? They are the gods who slaughtered the Egyptians in the desert. Be brave, Philistines. Fight like men, or we will become slaves to the Hebrews, just as they were slaves. So fight like men.
Okay. And notice both an understanding and a misunderstanding, right? You have them described, the Philistines are talking about gods of the Israelites, right? So they don't quite have that figured out. But they do know that, you know, this God has led them in battle against the Egyptians. So the Philistines fight, and what happens? Israel gets defeated, right? And they go taking off like crazy. I mean, you're told in verse 10, there's a slaughter, 30,000 foot soldiers. Right?
End up losing the ark too.
Yes. And it's also more sort of like, use bad English, more worse than that, right? Worser. Worser than that, the ark is captured. And sort of as a side note, the two sons of Eli were killed. And so somebody runs from the battle, gets to Shiloh, because Eli, ever since the ark had left, was kind of on edge, right? We're told that he's old, that his eyes are set or fixed, meaning he's blind. He can't see anymore. And so when this guy comes running in to bring the horrible news about what happens, he hears about it, he asks. And the guy says in verse 16, chapter 4, I've just come from the battle. I fled today. He said, how did it go? He says, Israel fled before the Philistines. There's also been a great slaughter among the troops. Your sons also are dead. The ark has been captured. And it wasn't until the ark is mentioned that you can tell that's what he's hanging on, right? And he fell over backwards, right? This is always why teachers tell their students, don't lean back in your chair, right? He fell over backwards, broke his neck, died. And he was old, he was heavy. And the final verse of, or part of verse 18, he judged Israel for 40 years. So Eli then is one of their judges. Meanwhile, his daughter-in-law, who is pregnant, was drawing near to birth. When she hears the news, this spurs the birth on. She will not survive. They tell her that she's had a son, and she names him Ichabod, right? Which means literally the glory has departed. And of course, this is where Ichabod Crane, I'm blanking on the name of the author from the Revolutionary Times. Anyway, is it Nathaniel Hawthorne or something? Anyway, Ichabod Crane. So that's not a good name, right? Most people don't name. There's a couple of Bible names, right? I've never met a Jezebel. I don't really want to. We'll meet her later on. That's a real evil queen. And then Ichabod tends not to be a name that's repeated, but the ark has departed. But then the Philistines take the ark and they put it in one of their temples. In this particular place, they take it to one of their towns. There's 5 Philistine towns. Ashdod is one. They take it, put it beside their God. The next morning, they walk into their little worship place and their God is face down in front of the ark. They think, well, that's not very good. So they set him back up. The next day when they come in, he's face down and chopped up. And we're told that's why they step over something. But even more importantly, in verse 6, it says that the Lord's hand is heavy upon them and strikes them with tumors. Now, some of you have a different word besides tumor. Anybody? Chapter 5, verse 6. Everybody got tumor? Okay. Many Bible scholars think that's a euphemism for hemorrhoids. Really bad hemorrhoids. Who knows for sure? But anyway, this is bad. And they kind of put, to use a math phrase, 2 and 2 together, that these bad things are happening to them because this symbol for the God of the Israelites is present. So they say, what should we do? And the inhabitants of Gath said, well, we'll take it, right? By the way, you may know, you've heard the name Gene Roddenberry, Star Trek, right? Many believe he based his Klingon characters on the Philistines. These battle folks, right? But who knows? Who knows? But the people in Gath say, ha, we'll take it. So they bring it, same kind of thing happens, right? There's a panic, there's tumors, they're having all these problems. So they go to Ekron. When it goes to Ekron, the people in Ekron say, what the heck are you sending that to us for? We don't want this problem. And so they finally all get together and they decide that this is all because they've got this Ark of the Covenant in their presence and it needs to go back to the Israelites. So in chapter 6, they send it back, but they don't send it back empty. They send it back with 5 gold tumors and 5 gold mice. And it never really talked about the mice before, but there was a pestilence that went through as well. and they thought the mice were the ones carrying this, or at least they might have shown up. We don't really know for sure, but it's funny. You must images of your tumors, images of the mice that ravaged the land, give glory to the God of Israel. And they also say, let's do this. Let's get a new cart. Let's get 2 milk cows who don't normally pull cart. And they said, let's find out if this really happened because God is making it happen, or if it happened because it was just bad luck and everybody had bad luck at the same time. And they decide that the way we're going to know is if the cart goes straight on down to where it's supposed to go and it stops in the right spot, then that we figured it out. It was God at work. And of course, that's what happens. And then when the ark gets there, they it's bad, right? Let's read. Chapter 6. Oh, let's start in verse 17, I guess.
Go ahead.
These are the gold tumors the Philistines sent as a guilt offering to the Lord, one each for Ashdod, Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron. And the number of the gold rats was according to the number of Philistine towns belonging to the 5 rulers, the fortified towns with their country villages. The large rock on which they set the ark of the Lord to a witness to this day in the field of Joshua of Beth Shemesh. But God struck down some of the men of Beth Shemesh, putting 70 of them to death because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. The people mourned because of the heavy blow the Lord had dealt them. And the men of Beth Shemesh asked, who can stand in the presence of the Lord, the holy God? To whom will the ark go up from here? Then they sent messengers to the people of Kiriath Jearim, saying, the Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to your place. So the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord. They took it to Abinadab's house on the hill and consecrated Eleazar, his son, to guard the ark of the Lord.
So again, you don't want to mess with this God stuff if you don't do it the right way, right? They treated it with disrespect. Did they look into it? Did they not agree? We don't know for sure exactly what it all means, but it's, when you talk about looking into it, all of us might think about Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's all these sorts of things. But it finally ends up in Kiriath Jearim, and that's where it sits. And then it talks about, interestingly enough, in chapter 7, verse 2, it says, a long time passed, some 20 years. Let's look at the picture here for a minute. So here are all these different towns and villages. And by the way, you've got Gaza, Ashkelon, Gath, Ashdod, and Ekron, right? So this is where the Philistines are. This is Philistine territory. And what happens? The ark goes from Shiloh to Aphek Ebenezer. This is when the Israelites lose the battle. And so the Philistines take it down here to Ashdod, right? Then it goes to Gath. Then it goes to Ekron. It doesn't ever mention specifically Gaza and Ashkelon, but remember, they also contributed mice and tumors. So it could have, we don't get all the information. But then finally, it comes down to Beth Shemesh. Doesn't work out so well there. And it ends up at Kiriath Jearim. So this little line is sort of this journey of the ark and where it all goes. And so this first several chapters sets us up with Samuel, sets us up with the ark and where the ark is. And now we will continue with our reading. Turn to Samuel, 1 Samuel 7, where we're at verse 3 through the end of the chapter. Would somebody read that?
Then Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Astars from among you. Direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So Israel put away the Baals and the Astars, and they served the Lord only.
Stop you there for just a moment. Samuel's the judge. They're doing the right thing, but notice the call to turn away from these false gods. Keep going.
Then Samuel said, gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered at Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before the Lord. They fasted that day and said, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the people of Israel in Mizpah. When the Philistines heard that the people of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. The people of Israel said to Samuel, do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, and pray that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. So Samuel took a sucking lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel. But the Lord thundered with a mighty voice that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion, and they routed before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah and pursued the Philistines and struck them down as far as beyond Bethkar.
And I'll stop you there. So when the Philistines hear that they gather together, they muster for war. And what's the fear of the people? The justifiable fear of the people is we're in for it, right? Because these Philistines have already been beating us up. Samuel says, don't worry. What do they do instead? They offer a lamb for a sacrifice. They worship. They're crying out to the Lord. And God thunders, right? Puts them into confusion and routes, right? So God fights for the Israelites. The Israelites are worshiping God. Let God do the fighting. We do the worship. And then they send off after and have a great victory. So now I'll keep going. You're going to hear about a rock. Verse 12, John.
Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Jeshanah, and named it Ebenezer, for he said, thus far the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel. The hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The towns that the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron to Gath, and Israel recovered their territory from the hand of the Philistines. There was peace also between Israel and the Amorites. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there. He administered justice there to Israel and built there an altar to the Lord.
So Samuel's the judge. The pattern continues, right? People sin. They cry out for help. God raises up a judge. And as long as the judge is alive, things seem to be going fairly well. So this is almost an extension of the narrative we've been following in Judges. But here is this stone set up again as a witness. Ebenezer means rock of my help or stone of my help. And some of you know in music that gets listed. Here I raise my Ebenezer. It's this sense of God helping us. Well, what's been the problem in the Judges? When the judge dies, it goes back to being bad again, right? And so in Samuel 8, we get this reading. It says, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. You've got Joel, you've got Abijah, but just like Eli's sons, these guys are not good. And interestingly enough, here's what the people say. Somebody pick up in verse 4 of chapter 8.
Wrong page. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, you are old and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to govern us. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me, from this day from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice only. You shall solemnly warn them, show them the ways of the king, who shall reign over them.
So what's the opinion of getting a king? Why did the people want a king? Everyone else has one. Can you not hear your son or daughter saying to you, but mom, but dad, everybody else is, right? I mean, that's pretty common behavior. All right. What else is going on?
I couldn't find that person in your.
Well, thank you very much, Siri. Glad for that. What? Oh dear. What does the getting of a king mean? At least according to this passage? Look at verse 7. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me being king. They have already got a king, right? But they aren't following, they aren't listening. And this is again another uncomfortable insight. God doesn't want them to have a king. They have a king. God doesn't think it's a good idea. And what's he tell Samuel to do? But before that, it says, listen to their voice. They want a king. If that's what they want, let them have it. But warn them. And what is the warning? Go ahead and keep reading.
So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your son and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen, to run before his chariots, and he will appoint himself commander of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain out of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day.
That doesn't sound good, does it? And by the way, it happens to sound like what they're going to get when Solomon comes to the throne. What's a king going to do? Well, king's going to start taking stuff from you. Taking stuff from you to do whatever it is he wants to do. And it's going to get so bad that you're going to not want that king. You're going to cry out. And that's the same word that they used when they cried out against the enemies that were attacking them after they had forsaken the Lord. But here, the Lord's not going to answer. It's a pretty solemn warning. What's the people's response? Finish up, Ed.
But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, no, we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them to the ears of the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice and set a king over them. Samuel then said to the people of Israel, each of you return home.
All right, so if you look at the picture here for a minute, you've got this little ballot box over here, right? Should they get a king? Should they get a prince? Yes or no? Certainly from this passage, it sounds like the vote is by the people. But is a king a good idea? No, right? And certain Bible verses or translations will use the word prince. And sometimes instead of prince, it says leader. And what's interesting, whenever that future ruler is referred to as a prince or a leader, it's always in a positive sense. Because if you have a prince and you have a leader, you can still have a king who's God. In some of these texts, this being one of them, they use the word king and it comes across in a negative sense, but there will be other places where king ends up being in a positive sense. And in chapter 9, we come to meet their very first king. And we meet a man from the tribe of Benjamin. His father is Kish. We hear about his grandfather, his great-grandfather, his great-great-grandfather, all the way kind of like we've done before. This guy's name is Saul. And as you probably got a chance to read, they had some donkeys wander off. So Saul took a servant. They went looking for him. And in the midst of all of this, they come bumping into Samuel. And Samuel anoints Saul king. So that's what's happening in chapters 9 and 10. And when Saul goes home, it says in chapter 10, verse 9, that he turned away to leave Samuel. God gave him another heart, which sounds pretty good, right? And let's read. We'll jump to verse 17. Somebody start reading chapter 10, verses 17 through 19.
Samuel summoned people to the Lord at Mizpah and said to them, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, from the hand of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all your calamities and your distresses. You have said, no, instead a king over. Now therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans."
So, thus says the Lord. Preamble. Remember that covenant parts? I brought you out of Israel, out of Egypt. I rescued you from the hands of the Egyptians, from the hands of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. There's this historical prologue. And what you expect to have next is, here's what you're supposed to do. But instead he's saying, this is what you're refusing to do. Right? You've rejected God. You said, no, we don't want God. We want a king. Positive or negative to having a king here? Not good, right? And yet, God is going to give them one. So they bring all the tribes together and they start casting lots, whatever that exactly is. Some sort of throwing something down that indicates something, right? Drawing straws, whatever it is. We don't know exactly for sure, but Benjamin is chosen. So then they bring all the Benjamin families together and you get the Matrites. Then you bring all the Matrites and you get Kish, and it's finally Saul. And they say, here's your king, and they can't find him. Remember where he is? He's hiding in the baggage, right? But when he stands up, he's apparently a very tall person, right? He's head and shoulders above everybody. And Samuel, verse 24, says to all the people, do you see the one whom the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him. And the people shouted, long live the king. So that's not just, medieval. That's been around for a while. And Samuel tells the people, this is what a king does, writes it in a book, puts it before the Lord. He sends the peoples back to their homes. And there's some people who are not too excited about him. You see that in verse 27. And now comes the test. You hear about Nahash, king of the Ammonites. He's been oppressing the Gadites and the Reubenites. He's gouging out eyes. I mean, this is pretty ugly. And it's all in Jabesh Gilead. In the book of Judges, we didn't spend much time there. All the tribes fight against the Benjaminites. And maybe you remember, they slaughtered them down to 600 people left. And all they've got are 600 men. And they sort of, get their blood fire under control and realize that they've all but wiped out one of the 12 tribes. And so they hold up and they get some wives, 400 of them from Jabesh Gilead. So Jabesh Gilead is very likely something for the Benjaminites, and Saul's a Benjaminite. Maybe a connection there, but Saul will go and rescue the people of Jabesh Gilead. And we'll get a chance, hopefully, to remember it, mention it, that when Saul dies and he's brutalized, the people of Jabesh Gilead go and take his body and give him a honorable burial. So you've got at the beginning of Saul's kingship, he rescues Jabesh Gilead. At the end of Saul's life, the people of Jabesh Gilead come and grab the bodies of Saul and his sons after they've been beheaded. It's nasty stuff, is it not? But it gets toward the end here. In Samuel chapter 12, we're getting to the end of Samuel's life and Samuel's reign. And he wants to know, have I cheated anybody? They said, no, you haven't cheated anybody. If I have cheated, I want to get that dealt with. But they are wanting to kind of finish up in a good way. Look at, let's see here. Where's a good place to jump in? Let's pick up for verse 13. So it's kind of right in the middle of a paragraph. Somebody read 13 to 18.
Now, here's the king you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you, as it was against your fathers. Now then.
I'll stop you there for just a minute. So what's the sense of a king here? Well, if the king will do the right thing, if the people will do the right thing, it's okay to have a king. But if it does, if the king and the people don't, that's not good. Keep going, John.
Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call upon the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king.
Okay, now how is it? Not good, right? The evil thing you did calling for a king. Finish up.
Then Samuel called upon the Lord, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain. So all the people stood in awe of the Lord and Samuel. So
there's a different kind of witness, not a stone that's set up or a pillar of some kind, but an act of nature. Keep going, John.
People all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we will not die, for we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. Do not be afraid, Samuel replied. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. And I will teach you the way that is good and right. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Yet if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will be swept away.
Okay, so this again has some covenant kind of language to it, but I love that little phrase where he says in 23, far be it from me that I should stop praying for you. So here's a nice model for all of us, even when we have friends, family, loved ones, people we know, neighbors, country, whatever, when you feel like they are not walking in the way God wants them to be, pray for them. Pray for them. And so in chapter 13, we hear the text does kind of missing pieces. So we don't know how old he was, and we don't know exactly how long he reigned. Something in 2 years, but it's not there. Saul marshals the people to fight against the Philistines, and they're successful, right? Samuel, though, had told Saul to wait 7 days because he would come for the sacrifice. What happened for the 7 days? Samuel didn't come. We're told in verse 8 that the people began to slip away. They started to go AWOL, right? So Saul said, I tell you what, I'll do the sacrifice. And he does it. And of course, this is going to happen. As soon as he's done, Samuel comes. And Samuel says, what did you do? He says, well, I saw the people slipping away. So I thought I better do something. And kind of what you have happening here is there's supposed to be a division between the office of the prophet judge and the office of the king. King's supposed to do king stuff, but don't try and do judge stuff. Don't try and do prophet stuff. Don't try and do priest stuff. So he's offering here a sacrifice. And so you get verse 13. I'll read. Samuel said to Saul, you've done foolishly. You have not kept the commandment. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now it won't, right? And God has, look at that phrase, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has appointed him to be ruler, to be prince, some translations will say, over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. So even as Saul's kingship begins, it's not going to last. And we hear about this person after God's own heart. There's a little bit more with Jonathan battling and we doing some great things, but let's skip ahead. We got to keep on moving here. We're going to bump into the Amalekites in chapter 15. And they are and the Amalekites are the ones that they were fighting with when they first came close to the promised land. And they're supposed to completely wipe them out. And this is the commandment. But what does Saul do? It says in verse 7, Saul defeated the Amalekites. 8, he took Agag alive, but utterly destroyed all the people. He spared Agag, the best of the sheep, the best of the cattle, the fatlings, the lambs, all that was valuable. He wouldn't destroy all of that, but anything that was worthless, he destroyed. Now, he was told to wipe out everything, but he saved some good stuff. Somebody pick up verse 10.
I am grieved that I have made Saul king, because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Samuel was troubled, and he cried out to the Lord all that night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up and went to meet Saul, but he was told, Saul has gone to Carmel. There he has set up a monument in his own honor and has turned and gone on down to Gilgal. When Samuel reached him, Saul said, the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. But Samuel said, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears? What is this lowing of cattle that I hear? Saul answered, the soldiers brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best of the sheep and cattle and sacrificed to the Lord your God, but we totally destroyed the rest. Stop, Samuel said to Saul. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, Saul replied. Samuel said, Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and he sent you on a mission, saying, Go and completely destroy those wicked people, the Amalekites. Make war on them until you have wiped them out. Why did you not obey God? Why did you pounce on the plunder and do evil in the eye of the Lord? But I did obey the Lord, Saul said. I went on the mission the Lord assigned me. I completely destroyed the Amalekites and brought back Agag, their king. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God in Gilgal. But Samuel replied, Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. But for rebellion is like the sin of divination, and arrogance like the evil of idolatry. Because you have rejected the Lord, the word of your Lord, he has rejected you as king. Then Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the Lord's command and your instructions. I was afraid of the people, and so I gave in to them. Now I beg you, forgive my sin and come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord. But Samuel said to him, I will not go back with you. You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel. As Samuel turned to leave, Saul caught hold of the hem of his robe, and it tore. Samuel said to him, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today, and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man, that he should not change his mind. Saul replied, I have sinned, but please honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel. Come back with me, so that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel went back with Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. Then Samuel said, Bring me Agag, king of the Amalekites. Agag came to him confidently, thinking, Surely the bitterness of death is past. But Samuel said, As your sword has made women childless, so will your mother be childless among women. And Samuel put Agag to death before the Lord at Gilgal. Then Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. And the Lord was grieved that he had made Saul king over Israel.
Not a pretty story, is it? Interestingly, it talks about verse 22 says, to obey is better than to sacrifice. And Saul later admits that he let the people get to him, and that he was unable to resist what they were suggesting. And so this is a rejection of Saul. It's not a pretty one. Mary, your version very much softened the end part of verse 33. Several of ours will probably say something like how he chopped him in pieces, right? Or something like, I mean, it's ugly, brutal stuff, but there is this permanent rift now. And guess what happens in chapter 16? You meet somebody new.
What I thought was interesting was he goes through all this and he basically gets rejected by the Lord, okay?
Yeah.
And then in verse 30, he says, can I come back with you to worship your Lord? You know, I mean, it's not like, can I worship God with you? But it's your Lord.
Yep. Yeah. Saul's on the way out and somebody new is on the rise up, right? This little boy named David. Now here, we're gonna, kind of hit the gas pedal and get moving on some of these pieces through. But if you got a chance to read this text, you'll quickly find that the David you and I were taught about in Sunday school is much more complex, or I should say, the real David is way more complex, and in some instances, way worse than what we were introduced. We got all the nice stuff in Sunday school, and later, when we get one of our last chapters in the Bible parts, and we get to the book of Chronicles, we'll circle back around to this. But what begins at this point then is this kind of struggle between David and Saul. They are sometimes Saul is very favorable toward David and supportive of David, right? Gives him one of his daughters as his wife, is excited that he kills Goliath, all of these things. But then there's other times when Saul is seeking to kill him. But you kind of get this if you want to do graphs, right? Saul's graph is starting to do this, and David's graph is starting to do this. And so chapter 16, we get introduced to David. The first part, David gets added to Saul's staff to play music for him. And it's a little confusing because as you read through, it sounds like there are places where Saul knows who David is and other times where he doesn't know who David is. And sometimes we don't know if these passages and stories are necessarily stitched together in chronological order or not. But David is on the rise. We have the David and Goliath story in chapter 17. And by the way, in another part of the book, it will talk about somebody else who killed Goliath. So we aren't quite sure how that all comes together. But David will meet Saul's son, Jonathan, and the two of them will become bosom buddies. Jonathan seems to recognize that David will become the king rather than himself. And still they are dearest of friends. You've got Saul trying to kill David in the back end of chapter 18. You've got Jonathan trying to stick up for him in chapter 19. Chapter 20 will tell us more about the friendship of David and Solomon. And David eventually, by the end of chapter 20, has to be on the run because he has no chance to survive if he stays around Saul. And so in chapter 21 and chapter 22 and chapter 23 and chapter 24, you keep reading about these sort of Saul searching for David. There's already an occasion where David could have had an opportunity to kill Saul. And it seems as if Saul relents of the bad intentions that he has, but then turns around later and begins to try and kill him. Samuel will die at the beginning of chapter 25. That's a little interlude there. Then you hear about David and Nabal. Nabal means fool, and it's from him that the wife Abigail will come to him eventually. Chapter 26, David has another opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't do so. And it seems like it puts a little temporary truce on one thing. But finally, interestingly enough, in chapter 27, David has to go to Gath. That's one of the Philistine 5 cities, and figures he better go live with him. And so that becomes his sort of home away from home. But interestingly enough, you'd think, well, wait a minute, how does that all work? Because David killed the Philistine champion. The pieces don't always line up. But eventually, the closing chapters of 1 Samuel are about Saul's death, right? In chapter 28, he goes to a medium or to a fortune teller or to a witch, depending on how your Bible translate that. Somebody who raises up the dead, wants a little seance or whatever they're called to get some information from Samuel. And all he's told is that this will be his demise. As the Philistines get ready to march out to fight the Israelites, David is going to offers to join them. Meanwhile, we didn't reference this, but David has been conducting all these campaigns against other peoples, completely wiping them out, bringing some tribute back to his Lord. And he says, where have you been fighting? And he says, oh, I was here in Judah or there in Judah. He doesn't really tell him what he was doing, but the Philistines don't want David to go along. When he gets back to his town, he discovers that it has been ransacked, and they go and bring everybody back. It's not always such a good thing. But in chapter 31, we read about the death of Saul, right? They're on a mountain called Gilboa, and it's on that mountain that all of 3 of Saul's sons are killed. Saul is so badly wounded that he first wants his armor bearer to just do him in so he doesn't have to be killed and sort of mutilated by the Philistines. Armor bearer refuses to do that, and so Saul falls on his sword, and that becomes the end. The next day, the Philistines come walking among the dead to pick up whatever they could find that would be useful. They find Saul and his sons kind of brutally, even though they're dead, chop off their heads, put the heads in the temple of their gods, impale their bodies up against the wall. And that's when the men of Jabesh Gilead come, take those bodies down and bury them. And so becomes the end of Saul. And that's also then the shift from 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel. David hears about the deaths and mourns greatly. And David is anointed king of Judah, which is his tribe. Meanwhile, one of Saul's sons is taken by Saul's general and is set up as a king over Israel. And it's interesting, it hasn't happened yet, but Judah will become the southern kingdom. The other tribes will become the northern kingdom of Israel. They're already sort of described in this way, which is a hint then that Bible scholars think these texts were written long after, again, all of these things had been actually come together. Abner, who is Saul's general, will eventually defect to David. This is in chapter 3 of 2 Samuel. But David's general, Joab, who is also his sister's son, so it's his cousin, knows that if David's going to take Abner as his general, that means he's going to lose his job. So he kills. I mean, there's lots of butchery, isn't there? And so Abner will kill him. Later on, that king, and some translations call him Ishbaal, some translations call him Ishbosheth. This son of Saul is murdered by two of his servants who take his head down to David. I mean, this is the stuff you see in Conan the Barbarian or something like that, if you ever watch those. But he's assassinated, and finally, chapter 5, David is anointed king for all Israel. Let's pick up and read there. 2 Samuel chapter 5.
All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler." When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a compact with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years.
So just take that passage, right? That passage tells you that these words are written after David is done. This is not this is not somebody following along, embedded in the army, reporting back, right? This is information that comes after. So David, king of the south, eventually joined with the king of the north. And this map that you see here in this next picture, this is now picture 8B on pages 88 and 89, show where the tribe of Judah is, this purple, and Hebron's kind of right in the middle of it. And then the Israelite tribes would be up here. And then we're going to see how he makes Jerusalem his capital. And notice how Jerusalem is kind of right on the border between the southern tribe of Judah and all the rest of the northern tribes. So let's be reading. Pick up, keep going in verse 6.
The king and his men marched to Jerusalem to attack the Jebusites who lived there. The Jebusites said to David, "You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off." They thought, "David cannot get in here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, the city of David. On that day, David said, anyone who conquers the Jebusites will have to use the water shafts to reach those lame and blind, who are David's enemies. That is why they say the blind and lame will not enter the palace. David then took up residence in the fortress and called it the City of David. He built up the area around it from the supporting terraces inward, and he became more and more powerful because the Lord God Almighty was with him. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. And David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. After he left Hebron, David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem, and more sons and daughters were born to him. These are the names of the children born to him there: Shemua, Sheila, Nathan, Solomon,
etc. How about we just say etc. at that point, right? Because what do you do when you're a king? You get a harem. And you try to have as many kids as you can have, right? But David marches in, takes Jerusalem. They say, hey, you couldn't even defeat us if we were all blind and lame. And it is a little sad here that it talks about how David hates the the blind and the lame. It becomes, and look at the what verse is that? That's verse 8.5, I guess, 8b. It says, therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. That be referring to the temple. So some will suggest that what we're being told in these passages is that David slaughtered the blind and the lame. But what's interesting is when Jesus goes into the temple, he heals the blind and the lame. So we kind of see again a difference there. But David takes Jerusalem, makes it the capital. So now you've got this new capital. The Philistines are going to fight. He conquers them. And in chapter 6, we read about the ark coming into Jerusalem. And so that's why this star here in the middle, and let's see if we can get, so here's your territory for Judah and Israel, then Jerusalem and the ark come, and they're kind of the star right over the top of it. It's kind of a unpleasant story as you're reading about it, and it also leads to a Saul's daughter will be an unfavored wife going forward after this. But now, chapter 7. Nicole, you want to read?
Sure, I can read. Starting at verse 1 of chapter 7?
Yes, please.
Okay. After the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, here I am, living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. Nathan replied to the king, whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you. That night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture and from the following the flock to be ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. And I will provide a palace for you, a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore, as they did at the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord Himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish His kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of His kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation.
Right? So did you notice, starting up in, let's see here, verse 9, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will, I will. What's happening here? You probably have a heading in your Bibles that talk about God making a covenant with David. And this covenant is going to be similar to the covenant that God made with Abraham. And we'll spend more time going into covenant details in the next session. But David has this idea at the beginning of this chapter. What is it?
I'm going to build God a temple.
I want to build a temple, right? God, I've got this beautiful house. God's living in a tent. And Nathan, his prophet, when he first hears this, tells him what in verse 3? Yeah, hey, it sounds like a great idea. Go for it. However, Nathan gets more than just his own thinking involved, right? Because we're told that night, the word of the Lord comes to him. And what's the word? What kind of house does God want? Doesn't want a house, right? Perfectly happy where?
In his tent.
In the tabernacle. What's the difference? The tent and the tabernacle is movable. The house sits, right? In one spot. And he even asks him in verse 7, hey, all along, did I ever say to anybody, hey, where's my house? Right? Interestingly enough, something to ponder. Christians often feel like until we have a building, can't really be a church. Well, it's not always such a wonderful thing. But anyway, but what does God say? And there's a little play on words here. He says, you want to build me a house, I will build a house out of you. And that's what this part of the picture is about here at the top. Okay. God says to David, I'm going to build a line of kings, a dynasty, a house out of you. And we're told that this house is going to be established forever, right? And that if one of your descendants sins, what's God not going to do? Take away his steadfast love like he did from Saul. There'll be punishment, there'll be suffering, there'll be consequences. But look at verse 16. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever. Your throne shall be established forever. And this promise will continue to play a role in the narrative going forward. And of course, just like the people made the assumption that they were chosen, which made them special, so we must be special and everybody else must be awful, kind of a misunderstanding that they're chosen for a purpose. Here, the sense of that God has chosen you forever, we can do whatever we want, and that the temple is never, or the dynasty is never going to get taken away. And we'll kind of see how that plays up. But David will pray about this and be grateful that God has offered this to him. It says in verse 27, For you, O Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, have made this revelation to your servant, saying, I will build you a house. Therefore, your servant has found courage to pray to you. And now, O Lord God, you are God, and your words are true. You have promised this good thing to your servant. Now, therefore, may it please you to bless the house of your servant, so that it may continue forever before you. For you, O Lord God, have spoken, and with your blessing shall the house of your servant be blessed forever. Beautiful, wonderful. But as we're going to see, it's going to go south pretty quick. We hear a little bit about David's wars and David's fighting in chapter 8. In chapter 9, we hear about how he shows kindness to one of the last remaining descendants of King Saul. In chapter 10, we start hearing about the battles that are fighting. And if you watch again on the screen here, see all these arrows that have all like these little strike things at the end. What David does is he subdues the Amalekites or Amalekites, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Syrians, and the yellow line with the border. That's how big David expands the realm, which is why he will be considered the greatest of all the kings of Israel, because he stretched the country to its largest part. The Philistines, they're subdued but not conquered, so that's why it's not white here. And if you recognize this territory at all from more modern times, yeah. And I don't know if it's a direct relation or not, but if you take the consonants, or you just leave the consonants from Philistines, it's the same consonants as Palestinians. So I'm not 100% sure, but shall we have a little historical battling between the people who live here and the people who live here? It's a bit unnerving. Yeah. And while everything seems to be going swimmingly, we get to chapter 11. And chapter 11 begins with these words: in the spring of the year, when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. And if you got a chance to read the text, what happens next is tragic. Because the king who lives in the highest house takes a little walk around, which also the height of his house gives him access to the backyards of everybody else's house. And he sees a woman who's beautiful bathing. He inquires who she is. She's Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Notice Hittite, right? Foreigner. But you'll find out later that he's part of David's bodyguard. And David wants her and has the power to do so, so he takes her. I don't know what your Bible says at its beginning. Mine says David commits adultery with Bathsheba. Might be more accurate, given the power differential, to say David rapes or something along that line, right? I mean, this, you can't talk about consensual here. But worse than that, she's pregnant. She becomes pregnant because of this. And what does David do? He sends to his general to have Uriah sent back. And then he gets Uriah rip-roaring drunk and sends him home, thinking, well, he's going to go home, be intimate with his wife. They don't have genetic testing. He'll think it's his, right? But Uriah does what? He doesn't, right? In fact, it's interesting. It says, in this is verse where 9, but Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house. He did not go down to his house. When David was told he didn't go down to his house, he said, you've just come from a journey. Why didn't you go down to your house? Uriah said, look, the ark, Israel, Judah, they're out living in tents. They're in booths. My lord Joab, all the army people are camping in the open field. Shall I go to be with my wife, go to my house, eat, drink, sleep with her? Come on, I'm not gonna do that. How evil would that be? Well, David tries it again. Doesn't change. And so finally, as you may know if you read it, he sends him back to the battle with a message to the general to put him up front in some place where the battle is the fiercest, pull back from the fight so that he'll be struck down dead. And that's what happens. And then we're told at the very end that David takes Bathsheba into his harem and eventually bears a son. So you got some time in here, right? Chapter 12. And then really even the little bit of introduction into chapter 12. Who would like to read?
Nathan condemns David. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord, and the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his meager fare and drink from his cup and lie in his bosom, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was loath to take one of his own flock of her to bear for the wayfarer who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared that for the guest who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. He said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom, and gave you the house of Israel and the son of Judah, and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have added as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, for you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this very sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, now the Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child that is born to you shall die. And Nathan went to his house.
Thanks. This tends not to be a story we got in Sunday school. It's brutal, it's ugly, it's shocking, it's horrific. And as you'll see, and maybe saw as you were reading, it's the beginning of a downhill slide that will get tragic in a lot of different ways. But what Nathan does is amazing, right? He comes in, he tells this story about this poor family that could only afford one little lamb, and that little lamb would be like a member of the family, right? Like the way many Americans treat their dogs or something. I mean, there's a way you could probably say it nowadays. This rich man has this guest, and I know I got to feed the guest, but I don't want to feed the guest. So you know what? I'm going to take this guy's lamb and use that to feed my guest. And of course, David, in the midst of hearing this story, gets up angrily and says, that man deserves to die. And Nathan says, yeah, I'm talking about you. And it's this kind of classic confrontation between a prophet and the king, right? And then comes the judgment that's pretty terrible, right? David did all of this in secret. God's going to let the same sort of thing happen out in the open. And again, another picture of some of the ways that judgment comes for sin is that what you try to do here and keep secret, God will let be out in the open and be multiplied. And probably the hardest part for us to try to make any sense of it all is how David is the one who survives and the child is the one who pays the price for his sin. And in fact, in that next section, which we won't take time to read here, the child becomes ill and David does everything possible to sort of fast and suffer and pray and mourn and grieve in hopes that this child will live. But the child does not and dies on the 7th day, which remember would be the day before the child was circumcised, and therefore the day before the child was given a name, and therefore the day before the child would really be considered present. And what happens next? In chapter 13, one of David's sons falls in love with his half-sister and gets a friend to scheme with him on how he can have his way with his half-sister. And so now the whole family starts to be shredded apart. And after seizing the sister and raping her, he in turn despises her, which is kind of like this double whammy. Her full brother Absalom hears about this. He's figured it out, right? These things aren't happening in secret. There's sense, when you read the text, you have a sense that they already kind of know these sorts of things are going on. And so then Absalom schemes on how to get revenge on his brother, and he eventually kills him. Then, meanwhile, after having been exiled for a period of time because of what he's done, he comes back and then he makes a grab for the throne. And David, that's happening in chapter 15. And then David is forced to flee from Jerusalem. And as he is fleeing from Jerusalem, one of his most trusted advisors agrees to serve as a spy. His name is Hushai. We hear a little bit about some of the conflict between Mephibosheth, who's that son of Saul, and Ziba, the servant of Saul, who was to care for him. Then there's another person from the tribe of Benjamin, which is the same tribe that Saul was from, Shimei, who curses him, throws rocks at him, hurls all kinds of insults at him. And back in the end of chapter 16, verse 15, there's another advisor whose name is Ahithophel, who is quite likely the grandfather of Bathsheba. Not 100% sure, but it's probably the case. And what does Ahithophel advise Absalom to do? Go sleep with your father's concubines. So there's that. You did it in secret. It's going to be done out in the open. So he parades in and does that. And then he says, what else should we do? And he tells him, you go right now. He says, let me take a crack group of troops. We're going to chase your father down. We'll find him, we'll kill him, and the whole kingdom will be yours. But there's this other counselor there, Hushai, and he says, well, let's get another opinion. And Hushai says, well, you know, Ahithophel usually has really good suggestions, but right now his isn't a good one because you know your dad, he's a fighter. He's not going to be sleeping with the troops. And instead, what you need to do is muster the whole countryside to chase after him. You can obliterate all of them, and everybody will see what a great warrior you are. and that becomes the advice he takes. And again, in ways that don't always make sense. Chapter 17, verses 23 and verse 23, you have Ahithophel realizing that his days are done. And so he goes and puts his house in order and takes his life. David's warned about this. He gets a chance to escape because if they would have followed Ahithophel's advice, it would have worked. But in the meantime, there's this battle between David's side and Absalom's side. David says, don't kill him, but General Joab does. And so Amnon is dead. Absalom is dead. The unnamed baby is dead. The daughter is, her whole life is ruined. And this is what shows here. You've got the stories of these deaths that are coming. And even when you get into the first part of Kings, when Solomon becomes king, you'll hear about Adonijah thinking, now I get to be king, and he's going to be killed by his brother Solomon. And what's interesting, your text will make reference to the 4 lambs. In Exodus 22, the following words are written. I'll read them quickly to you. If I can get the onion paper to turn the right time. When someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, the thief shall pay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So there's this kind of retribution that what David did once is going to be, remember he says that man deserves to die, got to pay for his own judgment is struck against him in this place. David is finally brought back to Jerusalem. He makes temporary peace with that Benjaminite Shimei. This is in chapter 19. He settles an agreement between Mephibosheth and Ziba. You hear about a guy named Barzillai, and then you get a rebelling against somebody named Sheba, another Benjaminite. This is Saul's tribe. In chapter 21, the Gibeonites come up to David, and he wants to know what he can do to appease the grievance they have against Saul, and they want basically 7 of Saul's family members killed. And so David says, okay. Because, when a new king comes to power from a different family, you got to wipe out the other family, because otherwise somebody from that family might come up and try and get you. This is messy, ugly stuff, right? You hear about some of the exploits that they do. You have this wonderful song of thanksgiving in chapters 22 and 23. You hear about David's mighty men, which includes Uriah the Hittite. You hear about the census that he gets at the end in 24 and how that proves to be a really bad idea and has some really bad consequences. But it ends with the plague ending at this threshing floor of a guy named Araunah, and that's where the temple is going to be eventually built. So what the heck is this idea of David, a man after God's own heart? Well, you'll see later on, looking backwards, that very likely it's what this little part of the picture is trying to explain. That amongst David's many faults, and he had many, among his many failings, he had many, he never worshiped other gods. And in fact, it's because of David that one God was worshiped in one place, and that one place is Jerusalem. And as you read through the narratives of Kings, you're going to see how that theme gets repeated over and over and over. And any king who does anything good in the temple is a good king, despite anything else about him. And any other king who encourages worship any other place besides Jerusalem is a bad king, no matter whatever good that king might have done. And so we'll pick up on that a little bit, but that's what this picture is. We have a little bit more to do in the first part of Kings. Because as you open the next scroll, you have an old King David. Remember, you turn from one scroll to the next. So we have at the end of 2 Samuel, David wanting to build this place, or wanting to buy this land, even though it was offered to him as a gift. He says, I'm not going to take it as a gift because I'm not going to offer God a sacrifice that doesn't cost me anything. And as you start in 1 Kings, we're told that the king is old. He's advanced in years. He couldn't get warm, no matter how many blankets they put on him. So they decided to go find the most beautiful girl, the most beautiful virgin in the realm, who would strip down, lay next to the king, and be his private warming heating blanket, which is essentially what's happening, right? So they found this beautiful woman, Abishag. They brought her to the king. Verse 4, she's very beautiful. She served him, but this beautiful naked woman laying next to the king, there was no sexual relationship. And look at the very next sentence. An impotent king is not competent to rule. And so his son Adonijah says, I'm going to be king. And what does he do? He gets Joab the general, verse 7. He gets Abiathar the priest. And I mean, you've got a little politicking happening here. Do you see it?
Mhm.
But Zadok the priest, Benaiah, who's the chief of the bodyguards, and Nathan the prophet and others, they don't buy in. And so Adonijah, verse 9, gets a sacrifice going, but he didn't invite any of the people who didn't vote for him. Meanwhile, Nathan comes to Bathsheba, verse 11, and says, have you got the news? You know, has your phone gone off? Did you get the news feed? The king doesn't know what's going on, and these guys are planning to take control. If you don't do something, you're going to be toast, and so is your son Solomon. And so they kind of partner together, and they scheme together, and they go into the king, and Bathsheba comes to David and says, gosh, I know you're getting old. Don't you remember you told me that Solomon could be king? And you get the sense that David's age is probably affecting his memory as well, right? His ability to function. And he says, you know, she says, Adonijah's become king. And now Nathan comes in and says the same thing. And so the king agrees, you know what, let's make Solomon king. Let him ride on my donkey and let us coronate him. And so that's what happens next. And of course, somebody sends an email over across to the place where the other guys, no, but the word gets on to the other people about what's happening. Everybody sort of disappears, and Adonijah comes up, and verse 49, all the guests got up trembling, went their own ways. Adonijah, fearing Solomon, got up, went to grasp the horns of the altar. Solomon said, what's the matter? Adonijah's afraid. He wants to see the king. Let the king swear he's not going to kill me. Solomon says, if he proves to be worthy, I won't kill him. And so he sends him home. And you get some instructions now. The throne is being passed on, and you have David dying in chapter 2, verses 10, 11, and 12. And it appears Solomon is going to be the king. And that's the end of the David story and the end of our topic tonight. Tends not to be, after I've read through these numerous times, I remember saying to my wife, if our daughter ever comes home and says, Dad, I found a guy I want to marry, he's just like David, I'm going to say, no, please, no. Right? And yet, one God, one place, Jerusalem. We'll pick up on that. Tough reading, but it gets us a little further into the cycle. Any questions before we jump to our prayers? I know we're a little over again tonight, time-wise.
Unusual.
No, yeah.
Didn't we have a saying in the church when I first joined here like 5 years ago? Like home of the 80-minute hour.
Home of the 80-minute hour, yeah, so we haven't even gone 2 hours yet. But let's pray these prayers together. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. And it is in dying that we're born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. Let me say this. I shared in an email with you about Luther's distinction between a hidden God and a revealed God. If you didn't get a chance to see that email, please look at that. I'll talk more about that. But it made me think here at the end, another thing that was attributed to Luther. Someone asked him, I'll paraphrase that, that we read these stories and they're horrible and awful and all these really ugly things happen. What do you say about that? And Luther said something like this. He said, in light of Jesus, I would tell God to do it again.
Say that again.
He says, in light of Jesus, I would tell God to do it again. So as we dig into this kind of nasty, unpleasant stuff, what's going to happen when we get to our New Testament is you're going to see, whoa, right? As God's heart gets revealed in Jesus, and you see what Jesus is up against in terms of the understanding of the people around him, I think you'll come to a fuller appreciation of that. So I always tell people, it's this part of the journey that we try to, at times it's like, I don't even want to keep reading this stuff anymore, but just keep pushing through. And you don't have to like everything you read in the Bible. And there's a lot of stuff in here that's very unpleasant and distasteful, but we're going to hang in there because we're getting to Jesus. So I'm going to stop our recording here.